Hello, I'm Violet, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans, and experts. This week on the podcast, I speak to Eleanor Carter-Smith, Head of Enterprise for Lamport Hall's Preservation Trust. In this role, Eleanor is responsible for aligning the vision, mission, and the goals of Lamport Hall's Preservation Trust with the needs and expectations of its visitors, stakeholders, and employees, and its local community. In today's episode, we explore the history of Lamport Hall, the family who built it, some of the notable figures who have visited over the years, and have been lucky enough to call it home. Eleanor and I also explore the amazing features of the estate today, what visitors can't afford to miss, and some of the key challenges being faced by the estate. We also talk about the future of Lamport Hall, and what we need to do as a collective to protect historic homes like this. But before all that, let's welcome our guest to the show. Eleanor, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I hope you're well.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Really excited to get into Lamport Hall. There's just so much, having seen it with you last year, there's just so much that we can, we've got to sort of dig into. But can you just begin by sharing with our listeners of Hidden Heritage a little bit more about who you are and what your role is at Lamport?
Yeah, so I'm Eleanor, as you said. I'm Head of Enterprises. So my relationship with Lamport started way back, so about 11 or 12 years ago now, when I did my internship there. So they supported the MA in Country House Art, History and Literature that was run at the University of Leicester. Unfortunately, it doesn't run anymore, but there was a whole group of us that came through that at Lamport with an internship. And then finished that after about 18 months. And I said to Vicky, who is now the operations manager, if anything ever comes back up at Lamport again, I'm passionate about the place and let me know. So I went off, worked in a few other houses, did an internship over in the USA at Country House there, and kind of used some experience with that, brought it back over, worked at Rockingham Castle, Delaprey Abbey, some other local houses.
What were they again, sorry?
Rockingham Castle and Delaprey Abbey.
Okay.
Kind of using that experience. So Delaprey was very commercial focused, and I realised actually that was something that I wanted to do more of. I think everyone gets caught up in thinking I want to research and I want to be a curator and all that kind of thing. But actually making these country houses relevant and coming from a commercial angle was something that really interested me. So then when Vicky called during COVID and said there's something coming up and it's to do with sort of engaging new audiences, I just jumped at the chance.
So cool. And Rockingham is obviously it's pretty much a stone's throw really from Lamport. Yeah. That's another castle on Heritage X, but it's an amazing place. That's amazing. And so tell me a little bit more about Lamport and where it is, and could you describe it to our listeners a little bit?
Yeah, so it's in the heart of Northamptonshire. Northamptonshire is a county that's known as the county of spires and squires. So we're full of churches and country houses. Most of them are privately owned. It sits within sort of a really high point over the Brampton Valley, has beautiful views, and it's a classical frontage, so dating from the 17th century. But the house has been built onto it over the centuries, all by the same family. So first purchased in 1560 from Lord Burleigh. The Isham family are still involved today, although they no longer live at the hall.
And because you live at the hall, don't you?
I do, yeah.
That's so amazing that you live on site. And as you said, it's in Northamptonshire, which is... I think I'm right in saying Northamptonshire is one of the most populated counties in the country for, as you said, did you say squires and...
Spires and squires.
Spires and squires. So Lamport Hall is a Grade 1 listed building with a fascinating and storied history. I would love to hear an overview of its history from you. When was it built, who by, and why did they build it?
So John Isham was the fourth son of 20 children. And he knew that he wasn't going to inherit anything, so he had to make his own way. Family seat was in Pytchley, and so it's a cadet branch of the Isham family who were based in Pytchley. And he wasn't going to inherit the family seat, so he went to London and became a mercer. So he was involved in the wool trade and trading silks with Europe as well. Once he'd made his fortune, he decided to buy his own family seat, and he purchased some land off Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, in 1560. There wasn't really much on the site at that point, but he built a Tudor manor house. And then over the centuries, people have just added on. There's not really much surviving now of the original Tudor manor, so you kind of have to piece things together a little bit. Yeah. Like any of these houses, it has been adapted to over the years to kind of suit different trends and different styles and fashions as well.
But it's passed through his line. And they've built onto it over the years.
Yeah, so it's always been the Isham family right from 1560.
Wow. And so Lamport Hall that we see today, is of what period in time?
Most of it is based from the 17th century with the classical frontage, but then there's Victorian, which is now the current entrance. So they changed the entrance so that it would have had a turning circle for carriages outside the classical frontage.
Yeah.
During the Victorian times, they decided to change that. So you still came down the original driveway, but there's now a Victorian porch, Victorian dining room and service quarters. So it's sort of a mix mainly of Victorian and that kind of classical John Webb frontage as well.
Yeah, because I was about to say, when you say classical frontage, what do you mean for our listeners?
So it means it's kind of inspired by Palladio. So it's basically all very balanced. So the original middle centre part was built in 1666, I believe. And then balancing wings were put on either end because it was all about having that kind of initial impact. And everything was very symmetrical based on Palladio and inspired by Inigo Jones as well.
There is something so pleasing to the eye when you drive up to Lamport.
Yeah.
Like it's so, you're right, it's so beautifully balanced. And it's the way it sits kind of in the landscape. So you don't necessarily know, or at least I didn't notice it when I was driving kind of around it. But then when you turn into Lamport and you drive up to the front, I actually did park in front of it, which I probably shouldn't have done at the time. But I just remember being really, there's something quite comforting about and like pleasing just seeing it so squarely sitting in the kind of landscape that it commands.
And people sometimes come through back entrances and things and you just don't get the same impact. So whenever we do big events, we always say you have to come down through the Swan Lodge entrance because people's guests, wedding guests, corporate, they get that kind of wow impact of it then.
Yeah, it really is amazing. Were there any kind of other leading notable figures in the past that have informed Lamport today?
Yeah, definitely. And whoever you talk to will have different ones. I think we all kind of like make connections to different family members. My personal favourite is Sir Thomas, who was the third baronet. And he went off on the Grand Tour in the late 17th century. He would have been a fairly early Grand Tourist and he went with his cousin who was only about 24, 25. They spent many years over on the continent and he spent the equivalent of about 3.5 million in today's money, basically bankrupted the family. And we still have letters surviving today from his mother begging him to come home.
Stop
There's
spending.
no money left. You have to come home.
Oh my gosh.
She managed to get him to Paris. He spent another, I think it was about 9 months there gambling and eventually did come home. So then they set up a marriage for him to the daughter of a wealthy Dutch merchant. But the night before the wedding, he died from smallpox and they never got the money. So his younger brother then inherited, but obviously inherited estate, which was
bankrupt.
Yes. So the collection we have today is we basically are in debt to Thomas for most of the key pieces in our collection. And we have more portraits of him than anyone else. Considering he died at 24, he has really left a lasting impact on Lamport and really a key person as to why Giles was able to make it into a charity, because it was felt that the collection was too important to break up. So we are really in debt to Sir Thomas even today.
Oh, wow. Even though he did, financially bankrupt the family, he left all these incredible assets there.
Yeah.
God, what? I can see why he's your favourite person.
Yeah, definitely.
I can so see that. What are some of your favourite stories about Lamport's history more broadly? So Thomas sounds like he was, as you said, the kind of, the guy that made the collection what it is today, and really a key reason why the Preservation Trust is in place to sustain it. But what are your other favourite stories about Lamport?
Well, the Isham family just never got rid of anything. So we still have all the record books. We have most of the letters. We have random receipts, everything. There's thousands of documents which are now in a local record office so that they can be cared for properly. But because of that, we're able to delve into the families and you really feel like you get to know each individual person. I kind of walk around the house and I feel like I know the portraits and the people looking back at me, which is lovely. And we have really key people. We've got Elizabeth Isham, who was 17th century, and she wrote what is believed to be the first autobiography by a woman, which is now over in a library in America. But she wrote a lot. No, they purchased it. Okay. So the original version has been purchased by them. But she wrote a lot about her kind of mental health at the time, which was just something which has never been touched on in that era. So not only a woman, but talking about her mental health and how she didn't want to get married. And that wasn't really something that she felt was right for her. Wow. And so we have a lot of people come over from all over the world who are studying her and her kind of complexities. So Elizabeth is a real character. And Mary Close as well was a Victorian Irish lady who married Sir Justinian. He was known as the silent baronet because apparently she did all the talking for both of them. But she did a lot of the many key architectural changes to the hall and is just a very key figure. There's just a lot of people that really left their mark and who we still talk about today, which is wonderful. You just think their legacy has continued.
Yeah. And what about Sir Charles Isham? Because I know he was a very famous figure as well.
So he's our eccentric.
Yeah.
Sir Charles was the son actually of Mary Close. So obviously he had a very kind of influential parents, I think. But he was very unusual for the time, being a vegetarian. For a long time, we thought that was because he was into animals and kind of like was very aware of what he was doing in that sense. As you think of vegetarians today, just thinking that they don't like farming and things. But he went hunting. So that was a strange coincidence. But we've looked further into him, and he was actually a spiritualist. And because of the eating of meat, he felt that he wouldn't be able to talk to spirits because his soul would have been sort of dirty if he'd been eating meat. So that was kind of his reasoning behind that. And yeah, he believed that he could talk to spirits and things. But his main eccentricity was that he went over to Germany and purchased good luck charms that miners took with them in Germany, these little terracotta figures. And he brought them back home, put them in the garden, and that's how the garden gnome was created.
Yes. and that really is one of Lamport's most kind of, for me at least, I remember going around it last year, and I just love these gnome figures that you've got this incredible collection of. So just explain what the rockery is.
So he created an alpine garden. So when he brought them back, he felt that they needed a space to live in. He moved his bedroom to that side of the hall so that he could watch over them, because he believed they came alive at night. But he created these whole scenes. So there's miners on strike and there's people working. There's this whole scene of little people that lived in the rockery. And he just created a miniature kind of Lilliputian world for them. He said that the rockery wasn't to survive after he died. He cared for it. He tended to it. The gardeners at the time didn't do anything with it.
Wow, they weren't allowed to touch it.
They weren't allowed to touch it. And after his death, he wanted it just to fall down and have it as something that he had cared for.
Okay.
Apparently, there were some visitors around the hall one day who gave him a tip, a sixpence tip for doing good work in the garden. He said it was the only honest money he ever earned.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. Because they obviously wouldn't have known probably who he was.
No, they just thought he was a gardener because he was pottering around doing his garden.
I love that. But it really is, it's like one of those standout features of Lamport. I mean, there are so many, but like for me, I just thought it was such a unique, it's such a unique feature for Lamport, this kind of amazing collection of gnomes. And I wonder if many people knew that gnomes were considered to be good luck charms in German mining kind of culture.
Yeah, I don't think it's really known. And he's travelled around a little bit because there's only one left now, the only original one left. He went to a gnome convention in New Zealand. I think that was in the 90s. And he's been to Chelsea. So the year that Chelsea Flower Show allowed garden gnomes back in again, he went there and had an interview with Alan Titchmarsh.
Wow.
So he really is our little USP. Whatever you think about garden gnomes, I think that is just such a unique story for us. And we do get people coming and saying, "Can I meet the gnome?"
Yeah. And what happened to all of the so the rockery was sort of dismantled after he passed?
Well, nobody actually dismantled it. It just fell a bit into disrepair. There's a family story that say that his daughters came with air rifles and shot them all. So we don't know where that's come from or if it's true, but that apparently is what happened to them all. And then in the 1950s, they found one gnome who'd fallen back into a crevice, and he was then brought into the house, and he's our pride and joy now.
Wow, that is amazing.
But we've just recently restored the rockery. So we got a grant from the Finis Scott Foundation, who deemed the rockery to be of historical importance. So it's been restored back to pretty much how it would have been during Charles's time, including the planting dwarf conifers and a little miniature waterfall and pond. And we've currently got an order some gnomes from the original gnome creators in Germany as well. So divided opinion slightly, but
why?
Well, some people just think that gnomes don't have a place really in a garden like Lamport.
Yeah.
Other people just see it as an expression of the history and a really important key part of our history. So we haven't gone too modern with it. They're heritage gnomes, and it's the original factory that they would have been made in. So
I think it's an amazing story to bring them back.
Yeah, I think so.
I really do. And just remind me, so Charles was, what period of time was he again?
He was late Victorian. When he had the hall, it was kind of going through the agricultural depression, and he was just known as being a really lovely person in terms of he never raised rents during that time. Whenever the church plate came round and during church on the Sunday, he would pick up the plate and run around the church so quickly that nobody felt they could put anything in it, then put £5 note in at the end and hand it back.
Wow.
Because he just didn't want anybody to ever feel that they couldn't afford or pay their way or whatever. But he spent a lot of money during his time. A few people have said that they feel almost like he didn't see his Lamport surviving beyond him because he only had daughters. So he spent a lot of money. There was only about £5 in the bank when it was inherited.
Wow.
And his sort of idea about the rockery as well. It was almost like he just thought Lamport existed to him and not beyond somehow.
Wow. And then what did happen to Lamport after
So they
died?
went back a few generations and they managed to find a cousin. So Severe Isham inherited, who was in the army at the time. He lived briefly at the hall, but then ended up renting it out to try and make some money. So there was a series of tenants, mostly who would come for the hunting, sort of Pytchley hunt area. And then they did move back into it again briefly, which is when Sir Giles first lived there and remembered living there and kind of made that connection then and that passion for Lamport. But he wasn't supposed to inherit either. But his elder brother was killed in World War I. So that kind of then fell on his shoulders as having to inherit unexpectedly.
Wow. Really, Lamport's history is fascinating because it really does sound like there are so many moments in its history where it could have been completely lost and it's somehow salvaged it, saved itself in a way. And let's talk about the wider estate and its role in the kind of local community, because it does have, I mean, I know, the stables for me were also a really big feature of Lamport when I went last year. I thought they were so breathtakingly beautiful. And at the time you had an exhibition on in the stables.
Yes.
And again, it really brought to life this incredible space. But one of my favourite things about Lamport as well was the mural in the stables. Yeah. Will you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's often quite overlooked. I think people don't really see it or realise its significance. But during World War II, the house was requisitioned. There was a British tank regiment, there was Italian prisoners of war, and there was free Czech soldiers. And the Italian prisoners of war were based in the stables, and they painted a mural of Florence from memory, which still survives today. And it is beautiful.
It's so beautiful. And it's so staggering to think because it's there in front of you.
Yeah.
With this really kind of extraordinary story and context to it. When I just remember looking at it and thinking, I can't believe these are Italian prisoners of war in this country at that time, somehow managing to kind of draw from their memory this incredibly beautiful and moving like painting of someone that they hold so dear. It's like, it says so much in one mural. It's incredible.
Definitely. And people who know Florence say how accurate it is as well.
Yeah.
So it must have come from a real place of passion, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Lamport, by virtue of being in the trust that it now is, the Preservation Trust, when was it put into the preservation?
1974.
Okay.
And then Sir Giles died in 1976. So he was really preparing it for the future. And he did manage, again, to track down a cousin who at this point was in Argentina on a cattle farm. And obviously had got this message, say, you are set to inherit. The conversations that they had over numerous years, a couple of decades really, was that it was becoming too much of a burden, death duties and taxes and things like that. And really, I don't think they'd had that real interest in running an estate. And by this point as well, Lamport had fallen into such a state of disrepair. It had a real dry rot problem to the point where at times it was known as the stately bungalow because it was you weren't able to go upstairs. So the idea was at that point just to let it fall into a ruin. People would come and visit and pay to come and visit it as a ruin. But Giles was so attached to it, especially the collection and the story and the history, that he put everything into restoring it. So he was very forward thinking. He spent many years creating that future for the house. He spoke to Burley House, who had done a private preservation trust a few years earlier, but they were really pioneers, him and Burley, and that future of country houses.
Wow. Because one of the questions I had is like, what were the stages of Lamport's disrepair through its history? But it sounds like that was probably one of the worst cases of it.
Yeah, so it never really recovered after the war. So as I said, it had tenants and they were on a repairing lease, and Lord Ludlow was one of the tenants who built the stables, and he put the panelling in the oak room, the silk wallpaper in the drawing room. So he was obviously looking after it and spending quite a lot of money on Lamport. Wow. But it was really World War II that had the biggest effect on Lamport, and they had no respect for it either. And that was the kind of turning point of it becoming quite badly looked after. And then obviously the National Trust had come to look around it, see if they wanted to take it on, and they were the ones that smelt the dry rot. And I don't think anyone quite realised the extent of it.
Wow.
It was kind of at every stage the dry rot was in the house and it really had a massive effect on it, to the point where we'd only really finished restoring it in the early sort of 2000s. I think 2003 the last room was finished. So wow. It took quite a long time.
A long time. And for anyone that doesn't know what dry rot is, what is dry rot?
It's basically just something which attacks wood in houses, and it affects their whole kind of fundamental basis. So if you think about how these houses had basically wooden frameworks, if something is eating away at that wood, the framework of the house is then lost, and the stability of the house is lost. So it was all into the roof, in between all of the rooms. So that had to all be stripped out and then rebuilt from scratch, basically.
Makes it so dangerous, but it was such a annoying. I mean, it is just this sort of ongoing annoying problem for so many historic houses. Annoying is the wrong word. Like devastating in some cases. But it's so interesting hearing about sort of Lamport's past, because it is so rich and there's so many fascinating characters. I mean, I know your favourite is Sir Thomas. I have to say Sir Charles for me is just so appealing, because I think the gnome is just so amazing, and it's gone on. That gnome kind of is almost virtually as famous as the house in some ways now.
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously, we just touched on the Preservation Trust. You've been there for 4 years, and I know there's an incredible kind of team behind Lamport. But what are some of the sort of current day-to-day challenges of running a historic house in your experience?
Our director, Mark Herod, he came in 2019 and obviously didn't quite know what was going to be just around the corner. So our previous director, George Dry, had been in the role since the 1980s, and he was the one that kind of pulled the house into the 21st century in some senses, and that it was functional and profitable, and it was self-sustaining, which was the key thing, which the National Trust had said would never happen. It couldn't be self-sustaining, and we got to that point.
Wow.
And then Mark came in, obviously, with then kind of bringing everything up to the real modern age. I think he's really enjoying that challenge of diversification and looking at what the country house is today. So we have all the challenges of any other country house, really, and that honestly our visitors are sort of an aging population, if you see what I mean. And sometimes we'll try and do things and we'll put on events and we'll diversify something in the cafe and we think, oh, this is great. And then they kind of vote with their feet and say, actually, no, this isn't quite what we want. So we're a young team. We know what we want from the future of country houses, but you have to look at your demographic as well.
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest challenge, is making sure that we are future-proof, but also appreciating what the core visitors are for us at the moment. So we're doing things which now work alongside those visitors. So we still do tours, we still do free flow, we still have head gardener tours, things like that are really popular. Tea and cake and cream teas.
In the stables. That's what I did that after my visit to Lamport. I ended up going to the cafe, which is incredible at Lamport. Like some of the most delicious food. I had a ham salad, and then I had a brownie, which was honestly one of the best brownies I've ever had. And I sat, and you can sit in the stables and eat, and it's fun, it's kind of like, it's almost theatrical, being able to sit in the stable, and there's such beautiful kind of stone floor, wooden sort of stables that are painted beautifully brown. Like, it's just a really fun experience actually being able to eat in there.
Definitely.
And I loved it. So I think there's that. Sorry to jump in, but I was a bit over enthusiastic about my lunch, but it was so good.
No, it's really good. And the girls who work there have worked so hard on making sure that it's a real expression of Lamport. Even silly things like the ham and sausage rolls are made in the next village. And so it's a local butcher. And the cakes, they go around to various cake ladies who work in the area, really small businesses. We've got one lady who makes cookies for us, who's got a business called Millie's Cookies. And she was literally in the newspaper when we put our order in, because she was just so thrilled that we'd kind of made her business for her.
Wow.
We put an order for 1,000 cookies in at the start of the year, and she said in the newspaper article, I thought it was a typo, like, this has made my business seem relevant.
Wow.
And so it's that effect that we can have on local people with our cafe produce as well. And then Amy, who looks after the cafe, she's done a project over the winter where she's converted a couple of unused storerooms into a snug area. So we've got local art up on the walls now, and just really relaxing areas that you can sit in and really just enjoy soaking up the atmosphere, which is so important.
So important. What would be your favourite rooms in Lamport? I know my favourite when I went last year was the cabinet room with the two beautiful 18th, 17th century?
They were 17th century, so they're one of Thomas's purchases.
Okay. The sun was flooding in, the light was sort of twinkling off, these cabinets. And I just remember thinking, gosh, how incredible. But I'd love to know a little bit about some of your favourite rooms at Lamport.
I think the drawing room is one that you can actually see yourself in.
Yes.
I think sometimes with country houses, it all seems almost theatrical, I suppose. And the high room, you walk in there and you think, well, what would I actually use this for?
Yes.
Whereas a drawing room, it has comfy sofas in, it has some lovely ceramics and a lovely fireplace. And that's a room that I think Mark has done a really good job with, where he's made it look lived in. We've got now like a drinks table with sort of whiskey decanters and as if someone's just left their magazine or newspaper on the side. And I think visitors are really appreciating that now, that we've just kind of updated with the 50th anniversary exhibition as well, and put a gramophone in there and chess set and things like that, because that was a room that Giles used a lot and we wanted people to feel like Giles had just left the room. Yeah. So that's probably one of my favourite rooms, I think.
And the high room, did you just call it the high?
High room, yeah.
The high room's amazing as well. Because I think my favourite painting in the high room, I think there's a painting of the Queen of Denmark, right?
Yeah, Anne of Denmark.
Anne of Denmark. And I absolutely adored that painting. And then also opposite her, what's the big painting?
Charles I.
Charles I,
yeah.
on horseback.
Yeah.
And we've actually used that image a little bit in Heritage X, but it's just so beautiful. It's just such an incredible room. And it kind of says what it is on the tin again with being a high room. But it really is very beautiful. But it's been open, Lamport, since 1976 to visitors. There's lots of decades that have gone before now where it's been open to the public and people can go and see it. When someone visits Lamport, how can they get the most out of it in your mind, Eleanor?
Well, when they come, if they pay full price, if they're not using historic houses or Gardener's World 2-for-1, they get an annual pass included in the ticket price. So we always say to people, make use of the annual pass, come back and see the gardens in all the seasons because they change so quickly. And also come and do a tour of the house, but also do free flow of the house, because you can kind of delve into those stories a little deeper. The guides give a brilliant overview, and I don't know how sometimes they manage to pack it all into an hour, but then you can come back and you can do it at your own pace then, and you can look in detail at those elements of the collection that you're interested in, talk to the room stewards and kind of do a bit of a deeper dive. And also we're just encouraging people as well to soak up the atmosphere, like I said to you previously, sit in the library and look through some of the books, and we've got a station at the moment where you can draw a portrait, and we're just doing things which we hope will kind of increase that dwell time for people. We've got the Gothic room open for the first time this year, which was Sir Giles's breakfast room.
Wow.
But we're playing Anna Karenina, which features Sir Giles opposite Greta Garbo. So
I didn't know
people
that.
are just sitting in there and watching this wonderful film, which it's just really nice to see people kind of not just rushing through on a tour, but sitting and watching a film and reading a book and drawing. And it's really nice.
I have to say my preference is always going around free flow, just because I love the guys, but I like taking my time. And some rooms I'll whiz through, other rooms I'll sit in for ages. Like the library, you just jogged my memory, but the library at Lamport is particularly special. Will you just describe it a little bit for us?
Yeah, so we've recently restored that room. So we're kind of going around now. So the house is safe and has been consolidated, but now it's a rolling programme of restoration. So we just completed the high room, and the library was completed at last year actually now. So that's gone back to a paint scheme which was 19th century, I believe. But there's still about 3,100 books in the library. And you just sit in the room and just the smells and the atmosphere of a library are just so soothing.
Who put the library in?
That it's been done over many generations. So there's been various baronets who were very into books. I believe it originally dates from the 18th century, the actual building. But there's been various book sales and things over the years just to try and keep, some very
wooden
important
floor,
book sales.
wooden paneling,
and a huge globe in the middle of the room as well, which we still don't know quite how they got that in the room. It never leaves.
Really?
No.
Just sort of diving back to the cabinets in the cabinet room, will you just share the story of how they ended up at Lamport? Because they're Chinese cabinets.
They're Neapolitan.
Oh, sorry, Neapolitan. Okay.
So apparently Sir Thomas travelled to Naples, and during that time it was still quite a dangerous trip to make through Italy to Naples, and people intended to spend sort of 6 to 9 days there.
Why was it dangerous?
Because there was bandits on the road. We know that Sir Thomas purchased pistols before he left Venice to go to Naples. So I think he was quite aware that it might be a fairly dangerous trip. But there were some key people working in Naples. So to have it kind of a complete grand tour collection, these cabinets were considered quite a key part. But in true Sir Thomas fashion, obviously he walked in and said, I want bigger and better than anyone else has ever had before. So whenever you look at very similar Neapolitan cabinets, they're usually about a third, 2/3 of the size of the ones that we've got. So.
Wow.
And experts often say that they're the biggest they've ever seen.
Wow.
So they're really, really key, really important. And then in terms of paintings, I'd probably say it's a Joan Carlyle that's in the Oak Room, although currently at the Tate. So we've got
Is it?
Yes. So they've got their Women Artists exhibition on at the moment. And Joan Carlyle was one of the first professional women artists in the UK. So
What period of time is there?
That's early 17th century.
Gosh. And what is the painting of?
So it's really interesting because it's also thought to be one of the first or the first self-portrait by a women artist. So she's painted herself with her family in Richmond Park on the left-hand side, and it's called The Stag Hunt. So there's a stag with the first depiction of an English crossbow in the middle, and then the Isham family on the right-hand side, with sort of Richmond Park in between the two. It's so beautiful. And Justinian Isham was on house arrest at Richmond Park at that point because of his royalist leanings. So that's why he was painted with them.
I see. God, how fascinating. And people can go and see that right now.
That's on at the Tate until the end of October.
Until the end of October. That's really good to know.
When it isn't at the Tate, it hangs in the Oak Room, and obviously can be viewed whenever we're open to the public. But there's been lots of academics who have asked for it to be reproduced. So you can probably find various publications on it as well.
Really? Wow. So Lamport Hall is obviously a fascinating building. The other thing I'd also love to just ask a question about, because it's been on my mind whilst we've been talking, I've forgotten about. But when you arrive at Lamport, there's incredible inscriptions around the sort of top, just below the roof of it. Will you just tell us the story of those inscriptions?
Again, that was Charles. So he used to write sort of doggerel verse and various different rhyming things and little mottos. That was another of his interests. So he had those inscribed on the hall in the late Victorian era. Things like I show, I sham not, and so a play on the name. And in things transitory, rest if no glory. So,
what does that mean? That means
I think it just means that, like, basically things don't stand still. Time doesn't stand still, and that legacy is no glory in things change.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
He was very clever in that way. And
he was a deep thinker.
Yes, definitely.
And actually, he clearly did have an eye on legacy in some way, shape or form in his legacy.
I don't think we probably give him enough credit for that. But
Really? And then moving on to Lamport's future, because what I find so concurrent across, like, Sir Thomas, Sir Charles, Sir Giles, like, they all never maybe quite meant to sort of end up in their hands. But when it did, they wanted it to be sustained and survive way beyond their own time. I mean, maybe Sir Charles didn't think that it would beyond his, but it did, and it does today. What are some of the exciting things that, domestic and international visitors to the UK of Lamport Hall, what have you got coming up this year that's really exciting? I know what I would love to come and see and do at Lamport, which is the Pretty Woman screening that's happening in the grounds, because I think it's just quite a fun way to soak up the kind of beauty that surrounds Lamport with an amazing backdrop and a very good film, which is Pretty Woman.
Yeah.
But what are some of the other things that are happening this summer, later into the year?
I think the one that I'm most looking forward to is on the 27th of July, which is going to be our 1930s cocktail party, which King West have really kindly sponsored for us. So we've been able to get in a jazz singer, we've got some swing dancers, we've got some 1930s cars, and we've got a gramophone DJ who plays actual 78 records, well as a local company coming in who do cocktails. So we're hoping everyone's going to get really into the spirit of things, dress up as the 1930s, and it would just be really nice to kind of see that era of Lamport recreated, because it was very briefly a country club in the early 1930s. Yes, so we're kind of trying to emulate that and bring that little slice of history back to life.
Wow, I was about to ask by the 1930s as the theme, but that's why.
1932, I believe it was.
Okay, who turned it into a country club version?
That was Sir Giles, who thought it might be a good business idea, but it seemed to fail within about 6 or 7 months. So
that is such a good idea, though, having a country club like that.
And we still have an attic full of all the leaflets that obviously just never went anywhere. So,
no.
It's really sad.
Oh my gosh. It'd be quite cool to have one of those on exhibition, actually, as like the attempted sort of entrepreneurial business idea by Sir Giles. But that's such a fun one. What's the legacy that you want to leave in your time at Lamport? I know you're not going anywhere, thank goodness. But what would be in your mind your legacy that you'd want to leave as the head of enterprises for Lamport?
I think it's just seeing its continued success. I want to see more and more people enjoying it, and I know that there is then limitations to that. And you have to think of the collection. You have to think, okay, what level do we actually want to get to? In my head, I would love to do more filming. We loved having the crown and having that legacy to show that we were a big player and we were able to get someone like Netflix to notice Lamport. That was a real achievement. So to do something like that again, and just the atmosphere and the buzz of having, well, you know yourself, of having a film set and a film crew, it was brilliant. It just seemed like somebody had noticed Lamport finally.
Yeah.
So I'd love that. And I'd love to have a festival of some description or a large music event. Again, just to make people aware that the backdrop, the front parkland, is beautiful. I can just see it all lit up with a stage and a band and thousands of people there really enjoying the space and soaking up Lamport and the history of it as well.
Yeah, and the carrot, I agree. Well, I can see that as well, because it really is a beautiful, beautiful landscape in front of Lamport as well. And are there any other kind of local things that you would suggest people do? A good pub or cafe that they can perhaps tag on to? I mean, I know that you've got the cafe at Lamport.
We have a very good cafe, yeah.
You do have a very good cafe. But if there was a good pub for a glass of wine or something afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone ever really thinks of Lamport as a destination as such. But we've converted a holiday cottage in the village, and it's just year on year now is becoming more and more successful. And I think people are noticing that Northamptonshire is actually a place to visit. So we would say probably come stay in our holiday cottage. Right opposite the cottage across the road is the Swan Pub, which does really lovely meals and has a really nice garden looking out over the Brampton Valley Way. But you're also in a real hub for enjoying Northamptonshire. So there's brilliant local houses. Calmarsh Hall is a couple of miles away. Holdenby, Coton Manor, which has flamingos in the garden, which is always fun.
Yeah. What's that called? Coton Manor?
Coton Manor, yeah. So all of these privately owned houses, you can go a bit further afield to Corby area with Rockingham and Dean Park, and you just use Lamport as a hub to explore all these wonderful houses. And then also you can go into Northampton. We've got the Derngate Theatre. You can go and see the Saints playing rugby. And Silverstone is just down the road as well. So on an international level too, we are a player.
So true. Actually, I kind of forget just how much there is in Northamptonshire. It's so easy to sort of overlook it as a county, but actually there's just so much there. I know that increasingly because of Heritage Acts and the time that we're now spending kind of getting around counties, but it is amazing. You know, I'm in awe of every single like trust or family that still do what they do, like mine do, and others, so many others, to maintain and sustain historic houses and their collections. What do you think we need to do to safeguard places like Lamport for the future?
I just think it's a case of not being scared of diversification. I think probably, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but maybe 10 years ago, your family might not have said, let's have a great big adventure playground.
No.
In the same way I'm sure Burley wouldn't have done.
No.
But it's not being scared of making that leap and getting away from the preconceived ideas of what a country house is and what a visit to a country house is as well. So Sir Giles probably wouldn't have thought Pretty Woman would be on his lawn. But there's things like that we can diversify. And I think being aware of our responsibilities in terms of things like net zero, and most of us will have estates and farmland, and having that responsibility is really important, I think, to really be kind of leaders, because we have the power to go forward and be leaders and set examples with net zero and climate change as well.
Totally. I think there's such a fundamental role that historic houses and the surrounding landscapes can play in offsetting or regenerative farming or rewilding, whatever you may choose to sort of do. It doesn't mean you have to do it across all of the land.
No, exactly.
But you can certainly act as a source for some sort of offsetting and play a really significant role in the sustainability story of the future.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the final question, which I kind of love asking this question, but if you could send a message to someone in your role 50 years from now, 60 years from now, what would that be?
I think it's probably, don't get caught up in your commercial head to start with. Walk around the house, sit in the house, get to know the portraits, get to know the family. And that's the biggest incentive. ever to want it to succeed.
Really?
I'll sit there on a Sunday night and I'll be genuinely excited to see what's come into my inbox on a Monday morning, to see what opportunities are there and who am I going to talk to this week and who am I going to be able to tell all about Lamport, because I feel like the Isham family have kind of passed me this little ball of responsibility. And I think once you know them and you realise how much they put into the hall, that it doesn't become a job anymore. You just want to instinctively make it happen. I think that's the most important thing, feeling that connection to the people that have come before you.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such wonderful advice. Well, Eleanor, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's been really fun.
It's been really, really fun learning more about Lamport. And it really is, in my eyes, I can't believe I didn't know about it when I came to see you last year. And it's ever since then become one of my favourite houses, because it has this fascinating history, but it's also got all these wonderful quirks that I think Sir Charles was very responsible for, and Sir Thomas for the collection, but Sir Charles for its quirks. And I think it's so cool what you're doing there. And I really, really encourage our listeners to find Lamport either on your own site or Heritage Explorer as well. You were one of our first partners on Heritage Explorer as well. So it's really exciting to be working with you, and thank you so much for coming down and sharing more about Lamport.
That's okay, thank you.
You can find out more about Lamport Hall and the Preservation Trust by visiting www.heritageexplore.com. If you want to find out more about the work we're doing at Heritage X, book your visit to Lamport Hall or any number of other historic houses across the UK, then go to our website www.heritageexplore.com. Goodbye, and I'll see you on the next episode.